It's March 29th, 1989, in the city of Tokyo, Japan. The air was heavy, with gray clouds hanging low over the skyline. Near the edges of the city, where the bustling streets faded into quieter industrial zones, a group of officers from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department arrived at a barren construction site in Koto City. The officers didn't find themselves here by chance. Earlier that day, a suspect in custody had confessed to something horrific, a crime that had led them to this desolate lot. His instructions were vague. Search for a metal drum near the edge of the construction site, one that was filled with concrete. The officers moved cautiously through the site, their search guided by the chilling confession. Their eyes scanned the ground, picking through piles of rubble and debris. Then, one of them stops. His gaze locks on a rusted drum, partially buried beneath the dirt. Its surface is streaked with grime, the metal corroded and pitted, being exposed to the elements. The officer crouches down, brushing away the loose earth with gloved hands. The drum, though battered by time, feels out of place. Its weight, its position, it doesn't look like something discarded at random. The two officers exchange a glance. One of them then reaches out, hesitates, then taps the drum lightly with his hand. The hollow sound that echoes back sends chills down their spines. Immediately, one of them steps back, his breath catching as the realization settles in. This was what they were here for. Inside this concrete drum were the remains of a girl who had been missing for months. Her name was Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old whose disappearance had left her family and community in anguish. But this drum contained more than just her body. It held the truth of a crime so vile, it defied human comprehension. For more than 40 agonizing days, Junko Furuta endured a relentless cycle of abuse and violence. She was stripped of her humanity and left to suffer unimaginable pain at the hands of 4 people. But this wasn't the work of seasoned criminals. In fact, the people who had inflicted such brutality on her were teenage boys. They didn't stop with physical abuse. They humiliated her, forced her into unthinkable acts, and even invited others to participate in her suffering. Dozens of people knew what was happening. Some of them watched, while others actively participated in her torment. Yet, not a single person stepped forward to intervene. But the most devastating truth was that Junko had come so painfully close to rescue. The police had actually arrived at the very house where she was being held captive. But instead of checking further, the officers turned away, believing the lies they were told. What happened to 17-year-old Junko Furuta was not just a murder. It was a harrowing glimpse into the depths of human cruelty and the apathy of a society that turned its back when she needed help the most. This is a story that continues to haunt those who hear it, not just because of the horrors that the 17-year-old endured, but for the deafening silence of those who knew what was happening but chose to look the other way. You're listening to a special edition episode of Heinous, produced by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Junko Furuta was born on January 18, 1971, in Misato, a small city in Saitama Prefecture, Japan. Nestled on the outskirts of Tokyo, Misato was a quiet, unassuming town where life moved at a steady pace, unbothered by the clamor of the nearby metropolis. It was in this setting that Junko spent her formative years, growing up in a modest home with her parents and 2 brothers, an older brother who often acted as a protector, and a younger brother who looked up to her with admiration. From a young age, Junko exhibited a quiet determination and a sense of responsibility that made her seem wiser and more mature than her age. Her teachers at Yashio Minami High School often spoke of her as an exemplary student, dedicated, focused, and rarely absent. She excelled academically and earned the respect of her classmates for her ability to balance her studies with her personal goals. Outside the classroom, Junko was equally driven. In October 1988, she took on a part-time job at a plastic molding factory. Working held a deep significance for her. She likely recognized the hard work her parents had put into raising her, and she wanted to do her part to ease their burden in any way she could. Her dreams extended beyond her small town. Junko had aspirations of becoming an idol singer, a profession that connected her love for music with her desire to inspire others. Though she kept these dreams mostly to herself, those closest to her knew how deeply she cherished the idea of standing on a stage, bringing joy to others through her voice. Like any teenager, Junko faced the usual challenges of adolescence, navigating friendships and school life. But she handled them with quiet strength and resilience. To her family, she was their source of pride. To her friends, someone you could trust. And to herself, a girl with big dreams and the drive to make them come true. For 17 years, her life was one of hope and potential, a future waiting to unfold. We know that life can be unpredictable, but what happened to Junko next was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. On the evening of November 25, 1988, 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano and 16-year-old Shinji Minato were cruising through the quiet streets of Misato on their motorcycles. Records state that both teenagers were high school dropouts, with several run-ins with the law at the time. Miyano, at 18, exuded a sense of authority, bolstered by his connections to the Yakuza. These ties fueled his arrogance, giving him a reputation as someone untouchable. Meanwhile, his 16-year-old accomplice, Minato, often took on the role of a follower, obediently carrying out Miyano's orders without hesitation. That night, their intent was as dark as the roads they traveled, robbing and preying on unsuspecting women. As they prowled the area, their eyes scanned for a target, searching for someone vulnerable, someone they could overpower. A couple miles away from where the two boys were, Junko Furuta had just finished her shift at the plastic factory. It was late, and the cool November air brushed against her face as she pedaled her bicycle through the familiar streets. The route home was one she knew by heart. Each turn she made was a reminder of her routine. The day had been tiring, but it was worth it. She was one step closer to her dreams, and as she made her way home, her thoughts likely wandered to the graduation trip she had been saving so diligently for. It was this sense of purpose that kept her going, even on days when exhaustion crept in. Unbeknownst to Junko, her path would soon intersect with Miyano and Minato, and her world would take an unimaginable turn. From a distance, Miyano spotted her, a lone girl on her bicycle, heading home. She was exactly the kind of target they were looking for. Acting on Miyano's orders, Minato accelerated his motorcycle, swerving close enough to kick Junko off her bicycle. The sudden impact sent her crashing to the ground, her belongings scattering as the two sped off into the shadows. But Miyano didn't leave. Instead, he circled back, slowing to a stop near the scene. With Junko still on the floor, he approached her. Appearing concerned, he offered to walk her home, a gesture that seemed kind and protective. Perhaps still shaking and vulnerable from the sudden fall, Junko accepted his offer. However, as they walked, Miyano subtly guided Junko away from her usual route, leading her toward a desolate area where an abandoned warehouse loomed in the shadows. Junko, still reeling from the earlier attack, likely felt unease creeping in as her surroundings became less familiar. She might have hesitated, her steps slowing, but Miyano's calm demeanor offered a sense of reassurance. Once they reached the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted sharply. Miyano's mask of concern dropped, replaced by a cold and menacing presence. His posture stiffened, and his tone turned sharp and commanding. Turning to Junko, Miyano claimed that he was a member of the Yakuza, and if she refused to follow his orders, she would face severe consequences. Trapped and powerless, Junko's options vanished before her. She was alone, far from the safety of her home, and in the clutches of someone whose intentions were anything but kind. Fearing for her life, she had no choice but to comply. The moments that followed marked the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would strip away her freedom, her dignity, and eventually, her life. After luring Junko into his control, Miyano hailed a taxi and took her to a hotel in Adachi. There, away from any prying eyes, Miyano launched his assault. He raped her repeatedly, exploiting her vulnerability and isolation. In that confined space, Junko was left entirely at his mercy. After committing the assault, Miyano made a call to a man named Joe Ogura, one of his closest accomplices. Over the phone, he boasted about what he had done, describing the events in detail. Disturbingly, Ogura was excited to hear about this and encouraged Miyano to take things further. He advised him not to release Junko, citing the potential consequences if he were to let her go. He then contacted his other accomplices, Minato and Yasushi Watanabe, to inform them of the situation. Together, the four boys began devising a plan that would become one of the most harrowing crimes in Japan's history. Several moments later, in the early morning hours of November 26th, Miyano led Junko to a park near the hotel. However, Ogura, Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe were already there, waiting. Using their knowledge of her home address as leverage, they threatened that the Yakuza would harm her family if she disobeyed their orders and warned that she would face unimaginable consequences if she even considered escaping. Once again, Junko, terrified and powerless, had no choice but to comply. As the group stood in the park, there must have been a brief but deliberate discussion about what to do with her next. Releasing her wasn't an option. Ogura had already made it clear that she couldn't be allowed to leave, and the group knew full well the consequences of her going to the authorities. Instead, the conversation shifted to how they could keep her under their control. The boys, emboldened by their twisted intentions, agreed that Junko would be kept for their continued pleasure. But they needed a place, somewhere secure and away from prying eyes. It was then that Minato offered up his family's home in Adachi. The second-floor room, he said, would provide the privacy they needed to carry out their plans without interruption. With the decision made, Junko was quickly brought to Minato's house. She would remain there for the next 42 days, trapped within those walls. Every single day, she was subjected to unspeakable torment, and her life was now dictated entirely by the cruel and twisted desires of her captors. Meanwhile, a day after Junko had not returned home, her parents had become overcome with worry and filed a missing persons report to the police. It had been 2 full days since their daughter failed to return home, and their concern had grown into fear. Junko wasn't the type to disappear without explanation, and her sudden absence left her family desperate for answers. However, her captors had already learned about the police report and moved quickly. They forced Junko to make a phone call to her mother, not just once, but 3 separate times. On each call, she was forced to assure her family that she had left voluntarily and was staying safely with friends. On the other end of the line, her parents were likely grappling with confusion and disbelief. The Junko they knew would never run away. She was responsible, dependable, and deeply connected to her family. Yet, as much as they wanted to dismiss the possibility, the calls planted a seed of doubt. Could this really be her choice? Was there something they didn't know? Despite these lingering uncertainties, their anxiety and worry for their daughter remained constant, as the situation still felt far from normal. The final call ended with a devastating blow. Under duress, Junko was forced to tell her mother to stop the investigation entirely. It was a cruel manipulation, and for Junko, the act of delivering those words must have been heartbreaking. Surrounded by her captors in an unfamiliar, hostile environment, she had no choice but to betray the very people who were her greatest source of love and safety. In that moment, Junko likely felt a deep, crushing despair. What might have been her only hope had been torn away. With the investigation out of the way, at least for now, the boys realized that they had to strengthen their cover so as to not raise any alarm in the house. Hence, when Minato's parents were present in the house, they instructed Junko to act as though she was Minato's girlfriend. Forced into this charade, she played the role under threat, but her every move was carefully watched by the boys. Minato's parents, initially believing the ruse, did not question her presence. But as days turned into weeks, it was getting harder to ignore that something terrible was happening in Minato's room. Strange noises, muffled cries, heavy thuds, and whispered conversations echoed from behind the closed door of Minato's room, often late into the night. The boys themselves came and went with alarming frequency, sometimes accompanied by other friends. Yet the door to the second-floor room remained tightly shut. But what was going on inside? The story of Junko Furuta is considered to be one of the most horrifying criminal cases in modern history. And what you're about to hear is an account of the next 42 days of her nightmare. Please be advised that some of the details may be deeply unsettling. When Junko was first brought to the room, the four boys, Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, had already begun to subject her to relentless abuse. Within those four walls, Junko was repeatedly raped and beaten. However, the assaults were not limited to the initial four boys. They had invited others to join in the abuse. Over the course of her captivity, it is estimated that as many as 100 individuals were aware of Junko's imprisonment, and several of them had participated in her suffering. Reports suggest that she was subjected to sexual assault over 400 times during the 42 days she was held captive. On the night of November 28th, the brutality inflicted upon her had immediately escalated to unimaginable levels. That night, the four boys had invited two additional individuals, Tetsuo Nakamura and Koichi Ihara, to join them in their acts of cruelty. Within the confines of Minato's room, Junko was subjected to a horrifying gang rape, with each of the six boys taking turns assaulting her. Immediately after the assault, the boys sought new ways to humiliate and degrade her further. Reports state that Miyano took a razor blade and shaved her pubic hair, and if this wasn't enough, he then used a lit match to burn her genital area, causing excruciating pain and leaving her with severe burns. Whenever Junko resisted their attacks or attempted to escape, the boys responded with violence. They burned her legs with lighters and dripped hot wax on her face. There were also multiple occasions where they inserted foreign objects into her body, including bottles and metal rods, causing severe internal injuries. There were days when as many as 12 individuals would assault her in a single day. Humiliation became a constant companion, as she was forced to remain naked for extended periods. Her vulnerability treated as a source of entertainment by her captors. Some of her abusers even urinated on her, and she was compelled to perform explicit acts for their amusement. She was beaten daily with golf clubs, iron rods, bamboo sticks, and other objects. Dumbbells were constantly dropped onto her body, and her head was repeatedly stomped against the ground. Hot wax was dripped onto her face, especially on her eyelids, which were also burned with cigarettes and lighters. She was deprived of proper food and water, often forced to eat cockroaches and drink her own urine to survive. Her captors even inserted fireworks into her private parts, causing severe burns and damage. In one horrifying incident, one of the boys had grabbed a pair of pliers and tore off her left nipple. In addition to this, she was at times suspended from the ceiling and used as a punching bag. She was also shoved into a freezer and left there for hours. Sewing needles were stabbed into her breasts and left embedded in her skin. Cigarettes and lighters were used to burn her genitals, and in one of the most horrific acts, a lit light bulb was inserted into her body until it shattered. By the end of her ordeal, her face was so swollen and damaged that her features were no longer discernible. Her body emitted the stench of infection and decay as her wounds festered. She was left bleeding heavily from the repeated assaults, wheezing as she struggled to breathe due to blood clogging her sinuses. On New Year's Day in 1989, Junko was unable to move, her body broken and her spirit crushed. She begged her captors to end her suffering, pleading for death as the only escape from her torment. However, they refused. As the weeks of captivity took their toll on Junko, the extent of her injuries and the deterioration of her appearance began to affect even her captors. The boys no longer found her attractive. Driven by their insatiable cruelty, they turned their focus elsewhere. Using the same strategy that had lured Junko into their clutches, they targeted another unsuspecting victim, a 19-year-old woman on her way home from work. They employed a calculated plan to isolate her, preying on her vulnerability, and proceeded to gang rape her. Not much is known about her identity or what happened to her immediately following the attack. But unlike Junko, this second victim was not held captive. After enduring a horrifying assault, she was freed and allowed to leave. Three days later, on January 4th, 1989, the boys were bored and forced Junko to play a game of mahjong. Despite her condition, she managed to win the game, which enraged the boys. Their retaliation was swift and brutal. Miyano began by igniting a candle and allowing the hot wax to drip onto Junko's face. He then grabbed her and placed two shortened candles on her eyelids, letting the wax drip down and into her eye sockets. At one point, they lifted her and kicked her with such force that she fell onto a stereo unit. The impact triggered violent convulsions, her body responding to the overwhelming trauma it had endured. Seeing this, the boys began to panic. Desperate to regain control of the situation, they decided to escalate their brutality. To avoid staining their hands with her blood, they covered their hands with plastic bags and proceeded to beat her savagely. Then, they dropped an iron exercise ball repeatedly onto her abdomen, causing catastrophic internal injuries. But this was not enough for Miyano. He wanted to take the violence even further. Grabbing a bottle of lighter fluid, he poured it all over Junko's body and set fire with a match. Junko made several weak attempts to extinguish the flames, but her strength was completely depleted after weeks of torture. Eventually, the fire raged on, and she stopped moving. Around 10 a.m. on January 4th, 1989, her 42-day ordeal of unimaginable suffering and cruelty had ended. Less than a day later, they devised a plan to dispose of her body in a way that they believed would ensure it was never discovered. They began wrapping her body in blankets and then placed it inside a large travel bag. This bag was then transported to a construction site in Koto, Tokyo, where they had acquired a 55-gallon metal drum. Using quick-drying concrete, they filled the drum and encased her body inside. Once the drum was sealed, they abandoned it in a vacant lot at the construction site. For nearly 3 months, Junko's body remained hidden in the drum, her family unaware of her fate, and her captors continuing with their lives as though nothing had happened. Unsurprisingly, Miyano and his accomplices continued their criminal behavior, engaging in theft and assault. But sometime in early 1989, Miyano and Ogura, both emboldened by their earlier crimes, were arrested in connection with the abduction and gang rape of a 19-year-old woman in December 1988. This was the same victim they had assaulted, while Junko was still being held captive in Minato's room. During police questioning, Miyano made a slip of the tongue. Believing that Ogura had already confessed to Junko's murder, he panicked and revealed the location of the drum, thinking that his involvement was already known. When police investigated the site Miyano described, they found the drum exactly as he had said, partially buried among construction debris. Inside, they uncovered the concrete-encased remains of Junko Furuta. This discovery shocked the investigators. The discovery of Junko Furuta's remains was a turning point in the investigation. Once the drum was retrieved and its horrifying contents revealed, the scope of the boy's cruelty became clear. For Junko's mother, the revelation was unbearable. Overcome with grief and shock, she fainted upon hearing the extent of her daughter's suffering. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly, and she required a long-term stay in a psychiatric hospital to cope with the trauma. As part of the investigation, an autopsy was conducted on Junko's remains. According to the report, small glass bottles were found still lodged in her rectal cavity, and it was also discovered that she was pregnant throughout the abuse, despite the severe damage to her uterus. Additionally, her face was so mutilated from the repeated assaults that investigators had to rely on her fingerprints to confirm her identity. Following the discovery of the body and the disturbing details from the autopsy, the police moved swiftly to ensure that those responsible faced justice. Miyano's confession had set the wheels in motion, and the police expanded their investigation to include his accomplices, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, Yasushi Watanabe, and any others who had participated in the crimes. The arrest of the boys swiftly followed, and the news sent shockwaves through their communities. Friends, neighbors, and even their families struggled to connect the horrific acts with the young men they thought they knew. Police say that over 100 people were believed to have known about Junko's captivity, with some directly participating in the abuse, and yet no one had come forward to help her. The media quickly picked up on the case, dubbing it as the concrete-encased high school girl murder. The details and the sheer length of Junko's ordeal drew national and international attention. Public outrage quickly erupted, with many demanding harsh punishment for the perpetrators and questioning how such acts of inhumanity could have occurred without any intervention. In the weeks following the arrests, the defendants were brought before the court. Because all the main suspects were minors at the time of the crime, their identities were initially protected under Japanese law. However, investigative journalists argued that the severity of their actions stripped them of any right to anonymity. This debate on whether or not to publish their names became a significant point of controversy at the time, but ultimately, it became irrelevant, as their names and photographs were published anyways. During the trial, the prosecution sought life sentences for the main offenders, emphasizing the calculated and prolonged nature of Junko's suffering. Meanwhile, the defense argued that the boys' actions were influenced by immaturity and a lack of guidance, urging the court to consider rehabilitation over retribution. For Junko's family, attending the trial was a relentless reminder of the suffering she endured. Her parents listened in anguish as the prosecutors detailed the physical and psychological torment inflicted on their daughter. Her mother, already fragile from the grief, often had to leave the courtroom, unable to bear the descriptions of what Junko had faced. The legal proceedings also revealed the roles of Minato's parents, who admitted they had been aware of something amiss, but claimed they were too afraid of their son and his friends to intervene. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that justice, even at its harshest, could never truly atone for what had happened to Junko. In July 1990, all 4 boys were found guilty by the Tokyo District Court for several charges. These include abduction for the purpose of sexual assault, confinement, rape, assault, murder, and the abandonment of a corpse. However, the sentences they received sparked outrage across Japan. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, was initially sentenced to 17 years in prison. He then tried to appeal this verdict, but in response, 20 years. His parents were also ordered to pay 50 million yen, or approximately $350,000 at the time, to Junko's family as compensation. Joe Ogura, the boy who told Miyano not to let Junko leave in the first place, was sentenced to a term of 5 to 10 years and ultimately served the maximum duration of 10 years. Yasushi Watanabe received a sentence ranging from 5 to 7 years and served the full 7 years. The last boy, Shinji Minato, was handed a sentence of 5 to 9 years. For many, these punishments seemed alarmingly lenient given the extent of the crimes. The lighter sentences were a result of Japan's juvenile justice system, which prioritizes rehabilitation over retribution for offenders under the age of 20. However, this leniency was met with widespread backlash. Critics argued that the severity of the crime far exceeded what the juvenile justice system was designed to handle. The courtroom was inundated with letters and calls demanding harsher sentences, with many expressing disbelief that the perpetrators could one day walk free. The public's anger extended beyond the courtroom. Vigils and protests were held, calling for reforms to the juvenile justice system. Junko's case became a symbol of the inadequacies in addressing violent crimes committed by minors. For her family and supporters, no amount of punishment seemed sufficient to truly reflect the suffering that she endured. Despite the sentences, the release dates of the boys came all too soon for many. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, all 4 had completed their terms. Yasushi Watanabe was released in 1996. Upon leaving prison, he left his hometown to live with his mother. Shinji Minato was released from prison in 1998 and went on to live with his mother. But in 2018, he was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. The incident occurred on a street in Kawaguchi, Saitama, where Minato struck a 32-year-old man in the shoulder with a metal baton and slashed his neck with a knife during a dispute over a parking space. In 2019, he was sentenced to a year and 6 months in prison, with the sentence suspended and probation imposed for 3 years. Joe Ogura was released from prison in 1999 and subsequently changed his last name to Kamisaku. After his release, he briefly worked in IT, but eventually became involved in organized crime after his past crimes became widely known. In 2004, he was arrested for assaulting Takatoshi Isono, a friend he suspected of being romantically involved with his own girlfriend. Ogura forced Isono into the trunk of his car and transported him to his mother's bar in Misato, where he brutally assaulted him for 4 hours. For this crime, Ogura was sentenced to 4 years in prison and was released in 2009. As for the ringleader, Hiroshi Miyano, his parents were left with no choice but to sell their family home in order to provide the compensation of 50 million yen to Junko Furuta's family. After his release in 2009, he changed his last name to Yokoyama. However, it seems that little else about the man has changed. In 2013, he was arrested on suspicion of bank fraud and orchestrating scam telephone calls. But despite the allegations, he refused to cooperate with the authorities and was ultimately not charged. Today, all 4 of the boys who played a role in the unspeakable crimes against Junko Furuta walk free, living their lives beyond the prison walls that once confined them. Furuta's funeral was held on April 2nd, 1989. It was a day heavy with grief as friends, family, and classmates gathered to say goodbye to a girl who had been taken from them in the most unimaginable way. Among the mourners, one of Junko's friends stood up to deliver a eulogy, a message that was written collectively by her classmates from school. Their words were a tribute to the vibrant life that she had lived and a sorrowful acknowledgement of the cruelty she had endured. Here's an excerpt of that eulogy. Jun-chan, welcome back. I never dreamed we would meet again like this. You were subjected to such cruelty, weren't you? You went through so much, didn't you? I'm upset with myself that I went on living, unaware of what was happening. You were always so gentle and cheerful, Jun-chan. The Japanese coat we made for the cultural festival looked wonderful on you. I'll never forget that. We will absolutely not let Jun-chan's death be in vain. As we step into adulthood, we'll strive for a world where such heinous crimes no longer exist. We'll do our best, keeping Jun-chan in our hearts and pushing forward. The principal even brought your diploma. Thanks to this, all 47 of us in Class 3 were able to graduate. Jun-chan, there's no more pain or suffering now. Rest peacefully. Farewell, Jun-chan. Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, is brought to you by One Up Media. This episode was produced and written by Guangjin, edited by Alex, narrated by Jason, audio experience by Ethan Sam, additional engineering by Ashley from One Up Media. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.